Peace. I am Phillip Roundtree, and you are tuned into the what's today? June 8th edition of Rhetorically Speaking. As you know, this is a Monday, so that means it's a hashtag You Good Man Men's discussion that's taking place today. As always, I got the regulars with me. I have Mr. Michael Onick, our social worker, master's level social work. We have our resident Negro dancer, Mr. Zane Booker, in the building. He missed the great intro I gave him a couple weeks back, man. He gonna have to go find it and replay it so he could hear it. But listen, we got a conversation that's on my heart tonight. I'm not no pastor, but I think that's what they say in the church, right? I got something on my chest tonight that I want to get out to the people, and it's serious. It's a serious topic. Now, I didn't want to come on here. I wanted to be funny. I wanted to be silly. I wanted to have some laughs or what have you. I didn't want to talk about the protest or the rebellion. I'm exhausted. Like I'm tapped out with all of that. But yesterday I got a phone call from one of my dear friends who I hadn't heard from in some months, and she called me to let me know that she was okay, which was a great thing, right? I hadn't talked to her in several months, reached out, but still never heard anything back. And she ended up telling me that she was involved in an abusive relationship, and my heart sank. My heart sank because it's that person who you would never see in a situation like that, right? I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. And so she started explaining to me the specifics and the particulars of it, and I'm just trying to take this all in. I'm trying to be present. I'm trying to be there for her. And it was difficult, right? It was difficult because, again, I'm not necessarily used to having these types of conversations with loved ones. Now, me being a social worker, me being a therapist, trust me, I've seen dozens and dozens of both unfortunately, uh, emotionally abusive relationships as well as physically violent relationships. And just to hear this, from somebody that I love, who's like, like we like Kim. That's my ace boon coon, right? Like we kinfolk. It took me to a place emotionally, and I can only imagine where it took her to even have the courage to not only leave that situation, which she did. She was able to leave that situation with the help of some friends. But then to be able to have this conversation, and in the midst of the conversation, I was hearing glimpse of the person I knew. She was laughing. She was, making jokes, and I'm like, you just getting out of that situation, and you're finding opportunities to laugh and to smile. That's a beautiful thing, right? That's a beautiful thing. And so it was just I was taken aback, man. I was taken aback. I was trying to understand, like the type of person that she ended up with. And, she started explaining to me the toxic traits of the brother. He was controlling, he was possessive, he was putting a tracker on her phone. They would be out, and he would ask her who she's talking to or who she's looking at. Apparently, he was uber jealous of me. I would send texts just checking in as a friend, but I don't know how that plays out in someone's mind, right? When you are that type of individual who's controlling, who is possessive. So today, again, I was sitting here like I don't want to talk about George Floyd, God bless the dead, the protest, the police. I don't want to talk about any of that. So I had no idea what the conversation was going to be, but it was on my heart within the last 20 minutes or so to have this conversation. And so I'm glad you, brother. I just sprung this on the brothers, within the last few minutes of us come before we came on, and I just want to have a real conversation about abuse, about physical, emotional abuse, mental abuse, and just the harm that it causes, our experiences in dealing with it, whether it's personal or just from the outside looking in. So So shout out to Michael Zane and Cabana who are gracing us today to have this conversation. So just to start off, what are your thoughts on just the idea of abuse and men in particular participating in this emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually abusive form of hate, and that's what I would call it, a form of hate. So we could start. We could start with you, Mike.
Like the first thought I think of is like, what are we teaching boys, right? What are we teaching boys as far as processing feelings, processing emotions? What are we teaching them as far as entitlement? What are we teaching them as far as what a woman represents to them in their life? Are we teaching them that women are property? Are we teaching that women are owed? Because there's certain traits that are taught that lead someone to become abusive, right? So I just think of like, what are the things where, what kind of examples are we given? And like, really the thing I think of most is we got to, I think of your shirt, Phil, unintentional plug, but that men feel too. And teaching boys how to deal with emotions and how to deal with feelings instead of like put on your tough guy skin and keep it moving, I think would do a lot in men being able to process tough situations without going to this place of like physical, emotional, mental abuse, right? So that's like the first place my head goes.
Yeah, yeah. What about you, Zane?
I mean, so the first thing that came to my mind was to sort of re-examine my relationship quickly over my head, and how a person can be abusive in small ways, which is probably similar to microaggressions and systemic racism language. Um, and I think we do get taught, like Mike was saying, we and if we don't directly get taught, we learn by taking in people's behavior and adults' behavior, and I think that's the challenge of the day, is to unlearn all the things that seem very habitual, seem not even but they are habits. You know what I mean? To unlearn all these things which don't have love at the core of them, right? So even love of self, love of the other person, like that's a real psychedelic way of saying it. It's a real artsy way of saying it, but I think a lot of people are realizing that that's the language that we have to translate into political language, into relationship language. You know what I mean? You have to sort of figure out what that means for you, and you have to examine yourself even when you don't think that you're being abusive. I've been trying to catch myself in how I deal with women. You know what I mean? And even how I deal with people. Uh, I remember the first time I started to think about it was how I dealt with homeless people. You know what I mean? And the disdain that you kind of feel, whether it's fear or whether it's whatever, you project that onto the person. This is an extreme case of psychological abuse and physical abuse, probably. And I know that a lot of men feel like, I don't know that. I have a lot of female friends, and anecdotally, they've told me stories about how psychologically abusive men can be via trying to control them.
Yeah, yeah. What about you, Cobb?
So I remember I recently celebrated. Well, last year I celebrated my 40th birthday, and one of the things that I decided to do was kind of spend some time with, do I actually feel like this, or was I taught this, right? Whatever this is, right? Um, and one of the things that came up was my relationship with women. You know, was I taught these behaviors, or even if you don't necessarily act on them, you suppress them, whatever you know what I mean, it's still the thought, so it challenged, it had me to I had to re-examine the way that I thought about the women in my life, starting with my mother to my sister, um, my wife, my daughters, and I don't know, like that when Zane was talking about like the microaggression, I definitely, I'm an introspective type of person. So when you say something, I kind of internalize it and process it as it relates to me. I don't think it's necessarily ego driven, but more of just like, oh, okay, well, what does this mean to me? How can this apply to me? Um, and I can honestly say that, my relationship, there's never been any physical abuse, but, maybe there's the language that I chose, as I dealt with different women in my life.
Mm.
Um, to have me going back and saying I'm sorry to a lot of people, a lot of women. I remember I apologized. I apologized to an ex out of the blue. I saw her somewhere and I apologized to her, and you know, it was kind of weird in the moment, but I know why I was doing it. So um, I think when you reach a certain level of maturity and you see the error in your ways, you try to go back and fix them.
Yeah, I sit and I think, about relationships because that's what conversations like that do. It forces you to be introspective, to start looking back on previous relationships to see what type of harm you might have caused. When I was on a conversation a few weeks back with Professor Crunk, Brittany Cooper, and she was talking about just this idea of how we're, and this isn't just endemic to women, right? And I'm sure Zane, you could speak specifically to to the abuse that takes place within the LGBTQ plus community. Oh, I'm sure there's some overlap there with reasoning and what have you. But she was just talking about just the harm that are done to women, and for me, it was in the sense of we're going to be harmed in some way. I think harm is on a continuum. And so, we have the extremes of the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, but then we have those microaggressions where we might not have said things in the best way. So the harm is on the opposite end, right? So you might have said something mean, right? And it's just like, that's harm. Um, Even though the impact might not necessarily be that of some type of abuse, but if we aren't cognizant and aware of the type of harm that we're causing, and doing that internal work to truly recognize how we're engaging with others, then you know we we can then fall victim, not even fall, I'm going to even use the term victim. We then could potentially become perpetrators of those higher types of harm. When we talk about, the abusive language, when we talk about the physical violence, she told me a little bit about the fella, and she talked about, briefly about some trauma. She told me he was a military vet dealing with PTSD, taking depression medication. He may or may not be going to therapy. But it just had like all of these markers for one who might potentially be abusive were there when she started to explain these things. When we talk about our military people coming home, right, from being active, and them not receiving the help that they so sorely need, whether it's by choice or by the lack of resources. Yes, they can go to the VA, but the VA will still give you the runaround, right? Because we're still dealing with people, we're still dealing with governmental agencies. I think about the reasoning why he might be on depressive meds. How did he get to that place to where he might need medication? Kudos to him for taking medication for it, but it clearly there's still work to be done. And it was just, I felt like I let her down in some way, right? And again, it's not about me, but I feel like maybe if I would have been more present, right, had more conversations, and you start to think about these things, you know, even though it's, you know, people are going to make the decisions that they make. Like, what if I was, you know, more present and having more conversations with her early and checking in on her well-being instead of once a month or once every 2 months. And I'm sure when she sits back and she starts to think, as she said, you know, was I missing signs in the beginning, right, with those microaggressions? And it's just a difficult thing for both survivors of abuse and then the loved ones of those survivors of abuse. And again, this isn't, you know, I don't have any questions formulated to you know, to ask you guys. Again, you could just hop in and give your thoughts as you see fit.
I was going to go back to, I mean, I can't speak. I guess while you were talking about PTSD and the way, you know, and all those things that sort of um, can cause people to be aggressive and abused, I was just thinking that I had a recent conversation with a friend of mine, and we don't grieve. We don't grieve. You know what I mean? We don't grieve any kind of loss. Like, we don't grieve, you know, I'm sure if you were in war, you saw somebody die, but when do you have a chance to really grieve? And, you know, and if you lose, death is one way, you know, but a job or like your freedom or all of these things, we never really grieve, you know what I mean? And I think that's a source of anger, you know what I mean? It gets, because I know if I speak for my family and I speak from what I observe in people, the go-to emotion is anger. You know what I mean? Like, my family is really loud,
Yeah.
very loud family. And I remember I was with a co-civil once and we were having a conversation and I was being passionate about something and I get loud. You know what I mean? People like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I never thought of that as being aggressive or abusive, because literally when my family gets together, the whole block shakes. Like, if we're playing games where we're just loud people,
Yeah.
um, you know that. You've been
I
around
do.
my
I
family.
do know that. That's why I was about to chime in. Then
Yeah,
let me go back on mute. But yeah,
we're loud. So you don't think of it as being aggressive, or you know, it doesn't really rise to the level in me of physical aggression. Like, I don't really have that inclination in me, but I can get really loud. But it's never, to me, would dawn on me that. Anyway, my point was those 2 points. One is about grieving, and suppressed grieving leads to anger, I think. And the other thing was about the habit of the way your family and the environment that you grow in, and how that way of communicating outside of that environment is very different.
what I would say, right? I'm sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead, Con.
Just to piggyback off of what Zane is saying, I feel like the low hanging fruit slash emotion is anger, right? Um, that's the easiest one to grab, right? For any circumstance, it's very easy to immediately jump to anger, stay in anger, live in anger, rather than reach to a higher. Um, like I said, I'm in this space of a whole lot of introspection, and that requires a lot for me. You know, I remember my mom recently shared with me that there was a period in her life where she had contemplated suicide because of infidelities of my father, and I remember how vulnerable she was in that time when she was sharing that with me. I always saw my mom in this one particular way, um, of just like, you're the hero, you're the savior, you know all, you're the best, you know, that kind of space. When she shared that with me, the first thing that I was able to point out in it was, obviously, she was very angry at the information that my father had shared with her about children that were, you know, unfortunately that he had and kind of like kept a secret and so forth. And she, you know, she thought again. Like it got it got to a place, you know, well, I won't go down there. She changed her mind rather quickly, didn't lean into that first emotion, that visceral kind of response to the information that she heard from my father. Um, and it was just encouraging to me, you know. You know how you think those things, but then when your mother says something to you, it just kind of makes it more. It makes it like the gold standard. It makes it like, oh yeah, you know. So it was very encouraging when my mom shared that with me, and that's something that I apply more so now. You know, not just go with the knee jerk reaction, which I feel like is anger in most instances, and kind of like mind for a deeper feeling or a deeper emotion and do that work.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you make a great point. A lot of times, see, there's a misconception, and not saying that you're saying it. Like anger isn't a healthy emotion. It's perfectly healthy to get angry, to get frustrated with a situation. But then, at what point do you catch yourself? Do you stop yourself? Do you take a step back, give yourself an opportunity to breathe, uh, and then to think critically about the situation? And so often, especially when we talk about our boys who turn into men, we're talking about anger left unchecked, or anger that's suppressed, which turns into that internal rage, that internal anger, both which can manifest themselves in that emotional abuse, in that physical abuse, either turned outward or turned inward. So I made a post earlier about just the importance of therapy and having healthy spaces to truly emote. And I was just like, men are telling their emotion, they're telling their feelings to whiskey, and I just started naming these different things, to alcohol, to promiscuity, to the gym. And I had a brother push back against the idea of physical fitness and in the gym. And I tried to explain to him that, one of the tenets of masculinity, modern masculinity, is this idea of strength and virility, right? And so, we're talking about the idea of having muscles, being big and strong, comparing yourself to your friends. A lot of us don't let that go, right? And so, yes, the gym and physical fitness can be a healthy way to get energy out, but it does nothing to curb whatever that antecedent is, whatever is causing you to feel those emotions, right? And so, again, I always use the analogy of the construction worker who goes to the job site who has a hammer, right? That'll get some stuff done, but what happens when that's not available, like we're seeing now, right? In the midst of this, in the midst of COVID, 2 months, 3 months, the gym has been closed. People don't have that outlet. So now, what healthy outlets do you have? And so, it's important. Then I also made a point, before I forget, about how so often, especially our black and brown boys, how they're often, well, let them get that anger out in athletics, right? Let them get that anger out in sports. And so, again, yes, is it a healthy way to get out some energy, so it's not misplaced? For sure. But again, are we teaching them the healthy ways to get out that energy? Because they're not going to be able to play football forever, right? Or they're taking that aggression right onto the field with them. So we see Vontez Burfict, who's continuously suspended for violent acts on the football field. We see basketball players who are unable to harness that emotion. And so again, I think we're doing boys who turn into be men a great disservice by not teaching them alternative outlets for these things like anger, so it doesn't reach a boiling point. I know you wanted to say something, Mike.
Well, yeah, I just think, I think one Zane hit on a big thing with this idea of grief, right? And I feel like a lot of the time we have like these storehouses of grief and trauma that are all unprocessed, right? And they become like the energy that we use in situations that make us uncomfortable. Like it's a reflexive thing. Like today, just having a conversation with my wife, she mentioned that like sometimes I'm very gaslighty, right? And it's not so much what I say, but that my tone will get like a little bit of an attitude to it, or kind of put me in a position where I'm higher than she is. And I don't even intentionally think of that, but like if she puts me on the spot, that's my pivot. So it's like I'm missing a bit of language when it comes to communication, basically, specifically in situations that make me uncomfortable. And it's not hard to trace. Like if I look at growing up and I look at the dysfunctional, abusive household I grew up in, of course I'm missing that language. But that awareness can't be changed unless I'm willing to really sit with that grief and that trauma that Zane talked about. If I'm willing to really sit there and process it, or else I'm always going to be in a stance of defense, waiting for the next attack, right? I feel like that's where I'm at most days. I'm just like waiting for the next person to come after me in some way.
Yeah.
And it's not a healthy way to live.
No, I dig it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Zane.
And I don't know how you. I mean, I know through therapy because I'm in therapy now, and I realize just relationship trauma is. I can't say it's the hardest, but I think it's the slipperiest, if that makes any sense, to sort of deal with. You know what I mean? Because it's like a ghost, like a bad ghost. Like you moved on, and then this thing happens, and then you still have some old habits, even though in the same moment you think you've moved on. You know what I mean? And it only takes one similar thing to sort of take off the scab of that emotional trauma that you had in that last relationship. You know, and I thought that my therapist sent me something that was real. This might be a little bit. It's not really off topic. It was definitely about relationships. That we have 5 intimacies. We have recreational intimacy, intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, emotional intimacy, and sexual intimacy. And you don't always get those things in the same person. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of the times when you don't get those things from that one person and you don't really know, like you said, you don't have the language, but some people don't have I didn't have the understanding of how to separate those things. You know what I mean? And really look at the person and say, oh, they weren't capable of that, or I wasn't capable of this. So I think that I used to think that intellect, if you were smart, that you should be able to figure out all these other things. I thought, don't you understand what I'm saying? Or don't you understand what I need? Or I understand you, why don't you understand me? And that way of thinking creates an abusive energy. You know what I mean? And I think I'm realizing now, if you can identify what that person is not capable of, it's way easier to see what you're not capable of. And then there's acceptance and not so much resentment and anger and being traumatized by feeling unloved because one of those things are missing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you bring up a great point. You said rise. I thought rise is. I think that's what you got to. But
Right, rises. And it's a therapist. Did I send you the clip? It's
no.
a really.
Oh yeah. I think you did. I think you did.
It's a Black female therapist, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name, but I could find it later.
Yeah.
But it was a brilliant sort of tool for me. Like I was like, wow, I can get into that.
Yeah.
It helps me.
And that just reminds me of, I believe it was Brene Brown and Oprah conversation where she was talking about how her husband isn't her soulmate, right? And that's why she has the friends that she has in order to meet those other needs that she has, because it's impossible to find all of everything in one person, and so it's important that we first recognize that, and then allow ourselves the opportunity to be open to having, you know, friendships and authentic friendships, especially as men. You know, back to the physical aspect of the abuse, I think it's, you know, we can all agree, like, yo, don't hit somebody, right? It's so easy to say, but then I know that years of exposure to violence, to trauma, could potentially have you hitting somebody. I think that's one of the biggest things that, you know, why I'm against spankings, right? Because a lot of times it leads to, again, physically interacting with another person in a way that's not conducive to their wellness, right? Whether it's fighting, whether it's, you know, you continuing this legacy of spanking. You know, we're, especially within the Black community, we have this, we romanticize the idea of physical discipline. And I think for many of us, we're getting away from that because we recognize that there are alternative methods to it. I'm reminded of, I just watched Color Purple. Like, I still haven't watched it in its entirety, but I remember that, you know, when he said, "You told Harpo to beat me,"
Yo,
right?
Phil, can I just, yo, I catch so much flack because I have never seen Color Purple. Like, people want to revoke like my black card for that because for some reason, I'll like, it'll come up in conversation and I'll be like, yo, I'm sorry, I can't really be in this conversation. I never saw like Color Purple in its entirety. What? You never saw Color Purple? So thank you very much that I'm not alone in this space.
I feel like Mike might be the litmus test of whether we keep our black cards when it comes to the Color Purple. Mike, have you seen the Color Purple?
I have not seen the color.
Okay,
Purple.
all right, we good.
I don't understand that logic, but okay, I'll roll with it. I really don't understand that logic.
Like they have these
As
random,
a man that studies the culture, like
there's like these random things that there's these things that you have to be, you know, that validate your blackness or whatever. And apparently, seeing Color Purple in its entirety is one of them because anytime I mention it, it's like it's like
that
the whole room gasp and looks at me.
Yeah,
And I'm
and
like,
that crosses classes too. So we can't, you know, different classes of Black folk have different canons of shit that you should have seen
well, and that goes to
or read.
that goes to individuals being black supremacists, according to Mr. Terry Crews.
I guess that's another conversation.
Yeah, that's another
Terry
conversation.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Look,
Oh man, listen, we don't even want to have that conversation. Not yet.
you
But
can't say these things. Some of the things it's rocks are gonna come through the screen. Like it's just
yeah, but you know, I sit and watch that, and you know, it's just how it's like for a lot of individuals who are abusive, like they're like indoctrinated into it. I'm reminded of a Different World episode where, you know, the one sister was in an abusive relationship, and he talked about, you know, I saw at 16, I saw my mother get punched in the face by my father, and you know that got her in line. And so again, that this whole sixth season of A Different World touches on so many different issues related to just black folk and just some of societal ills. But you know, again, it makes me recognize and me to have a little bit of empathy for these individuals, right? Because I just don't think somebody just grows up from the womb starting to have this idea of I want to be a physically abusive adult when I get older, right? It's a result of the adults that are around them, the culture that they're around, everything that's influencing them. And go ahead.
I've said this before: is we live in a culture that puts violence and fighting on a pedestal.
Yeah.
Like that is what power is. And if that's your definition of power, then it shouldn't surprise us that it seeps down into the most intimate of our relationships. You know what I mean? We live in a world, a huge world where violence is power.
Yeah.
And on a state, on a national level, on a state level, on a city level, on a personal level, especially amongst people of color. You know what I mean? I think that that's because, and as a gay man, I had to figure out how to project the possibility to be violent. You know what I mean? It's called your subway face.
Yeah.
Right? So that nobody is going to try you. And that was after my mother had to lock me out of my house because I kept coming home crying at like 9 or 10 or 11 years old. She said, you got to stay outside and fight, because that was the environment. I was a feminine kid and people used to mess with me. And eventually I had to stand up for myself. Now I'm glad that she did that, but I'm also glad that I didn't stay in that lane, because I know a lot of gay men who stay in that lane.
Yeah.
A lot of people are so enamored with the ballroom scene, and they should be, because it's a wonderful space. But a lot of the kids who had to walk through their neighborhoods, they had to fight. So they carried that energy into their recreational space, right? And they mature out of it. Like I know some kids in the ballroom scene who has matured out of that fighting all the time. But if you're a gay kid, you know what I mean, or a queer kid walking through, a male or a female walking in a gender space that doesn't seem to fit you, especially to the outside world, you're gonna have to fight, especially if you're in the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're gonna have to fight. So, I mean, my space was short. Like I had to do that period of time, and then I could be in my neighborhood. Now you've done it. That was back in the day, but now, you know what I mean? It's different. But I'm saying that those young kids who walk in their truth, who strut in their truth, who live their truth, that violence doesn't come from anywhere. I mean, from nowhere. You know what I mean? It comes because they feel aggressed by the outside world and they have to defend themselves. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but you live in a world where you always are ready to fight.
Yeah.
You always are ready to fight. So how do you let that go when you're in a personal relationship?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what isn't taught. And I think that goes back to the point
I
of,
like how Zane brought up
go
culture
ahead.
too.
Go ahead. Say it again, Mike.
No, I like how Zane brought up I like the idea that Zane brought up there about it being a culture of violence, right?
Yeah.
A culture of wanting to establish ourselves as the tough guy or the person that can take a hit. Like I remember in 4th grade, I moved to a different school, and within a week, I picked a fight with a kid because I figured it would get me in good with certain people. And I wasn't even like a violent kid. Like I was tiny. I wasn't some fighter, but like for some reason in 4th grade, I was able to figure out that aggression would benefit me here. And like, that's more than that's like a learned behavior. That is culturally being put into my head by my surroundings.
Yeah.
So it's just there.
Yeah. So how can we adequately prepare our children for the world that they live in, right? Which will require some exposure to violence, right? And it will require them, unfortunately, to be able to have the ability to exert aggression and violence at times. If we just being real, because if it's not going to go away, right? So how do we juggle that by in a healthiest way as possible, where we can expose them to violence, where we can let them know, listen, you might have to protect yourself, but again, not letting it get out of control to where, they're taking in, again, this entire culture of violence.
So one of the things me and my wife always talk about, right, is this idea of being proactive parents as opposed to reactive parents, right? So you don't necessarily have to put your child, or I won't even say child, but maybe somebody doesn't have the maybe somebody isn't a parent right now, right? But you might be mentoring somebody or something, right? So you don't necessarily have to put them in a violent situation. You can just have those conversations. Like I always told my wife, I want to have that conversation with my daughter as it deals with race, as it deals with all the societal ills, right? All the things that are just very, very difficult to talk about, right? I want to have the first conversation with my daughter as opposed to her going out, having some experience with it, and now I'm doing reactive parenting. Right now, I'm trying to fix whatever the damage was that was done. So I'm big on proactive, right? So, hey, like with this situation that we're dealing with now, I didn't see it. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I didn't see it fit to show, what actually happened to George Floyd, but I did have a conversation with my daughter, told her what happened, just so she can understand, and told her the pattern of behavior as it relates to, the way that cops tend to deal with men who look like your dad, you know, um, and me doing that, being proactive in my approach. I feel like, obviously I don't know the end result because we're still in the process of her growing up and maturing. I won't see the fruits of my labor until maybe she's 18, 21.
Yeah.
But I honestly feel like that I'm doing what's right, by being proactive as opposed to reactive. I think that that's one of the issues that kind of like can happen is, the damage unfortunately is already done and you're trying to fix whatever. So, they go out there, have some type of experience, and now, their mind, their understanding is already being shaped, is already being formed. You know what I mean? As opposed to if you introduce it in kind of like this controlled environment, I feel like, you can control the situation a little bit more because you are being proactive in it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I did, and it wasn't just about violence, and I tried this once I became an adult, is that I would not have a television in my house. And it was amazing how different I sort of, certain things were less. Like I realized, and somebody would always give me a television. Somebody would come in, an aunt or somebody, you don't have a TV? That's crazy. Here. But like for at least a year or 2 years, I would not, and I would listen to the radio or something. It helped me be creative. But what I'm saying is, you don't realize how much media plants things into your head. Just an example, Entertainment Tonight, right? That's one of the things me and my sister do when we watch TV. That's part of capitalism brainwashing, right? That being a star, being successful, that you get inundated with these images of what success is. And you can see how your dreams start to shift toward that. But when I just had the radio, and Phil, excuse me, and I was just playing WRD all the time.
Hey, shout out the cop
remember
who talked me off a ledge yesterday.
Shots fired. Bang, bang, bang.
I had just moved into my house, and I remember that the idea for my company, which was a artistic dance company and a thing that talked about HIV, like that was a main platform, like that was our discussion, and I was discouraged by that. But I'm just saying, it went from my dreams went from having a traditional sort of company that would do great work and travel the world to doing something that was community based, because that's what I was feeding myself. That's what I'm saying. So, and I wasn't intentionally looking to change. I just knew that I wanted to read more. That was my only goal. Like if I don't have a TV, maybe I'll read more. But in that space, I would listen to the radio, and I would listen to talk radio a lot. That information was coming into my head, and then my dreams shifted. And I'm just saying that about violence. We see so much violence. How else, even if your parents don't actually say anything, how else do you learn to react to stuff? You know what I mean? You learn from watching Scarface, from watching, Boys in the Hood, from watching Nino Brown, from watching uh, Matrix,
Yeah.
Star Wars, even. All these things have fighting in them. You know what I mean? And the hero is the best fighter.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And you think that you don't think it, but you end up being like that with your interpersonal relationships. You end up being like that.
Yeah.
I know.
No. Those are great points. I think of you're talking. I'm thinking about my daughter who's 11, and she plays this game Roblox. So it's a whole bunch of mini games on there, just created by different people, right? One that she likes is Bloxburg, where this is where I really realized that she has this eye for engineering, and just seeing her build houses, with the attention to detail within the house, the lampshade, it was just so much, which is like, wow. Then she likes playing a game called The Towers, where it's just like a puzzle. You jump up, but when you fall, you break into pieces and you die. We don't think about that as nothing, and I just now like that is kind of violent, right? To see a puzzle piece fall to the ground and it just breaks into pieces. And again, it's the planting the seeds of the violence. And then some of the extreme games, they have shooting games. Again, and the age range for children who play Roblox starts as early as, I want to say 4 or 5. And they're just out here playing these different games. I was playing a police game with her, and we had to escape jail. And it's just like, wait, what? Like, nah, this isn't what we doing. But they have access to phones, they have access to computers, and they have access to so much. They're being inundated with it. So it's not even necessarily the TV shows these days that it once might have been for us. It's these games that are geared towards children, or the content that are geared towards children. And the reason why we have to be, diligent in our efforts.
Balancing it, at
Yeah.
least balancing it. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? My dad tried to balance it, and that's the only reason why I even would think of books, because he took me to the library before I even knew how to write my name.
Yeah. And I think so much of
Yeah, I feel,
what we desire is this immediate gratification, and a lot of the times in that immediate gratification, it's coming from something that's potentially harmful. And so again, it's one of those things that we have to be diligent of, whether it's as parents and just as those who interact with younger people. So when they do grow up and they start to have these interpersonal relationships, that again starts at an early age, right? Just how they're interacting with so and so, and then how they're interacting with their peers, paying attention to the behavioral grades that they're getting, how what the individual write-ups are, because again, all of these things, I think if we truly take a step back and truly look at, we start to see some of the potential signs that more damaging and harmful behaviors are to come. Go ahead, Mike. What were you about to say?
yeah, I just feel like we're all getting at the same idea, which is like, how do we take control of the conversation, right? And I think, Phil, you just brought up a good point where, like, it's not as simple as just not having a TV anymore. There's messaging everywhere.
Yeah.
Like my little sister, who's like 12, has had a phone for 2 years. You know what I mean?
Mm.
If you have a phone, you have access to things that are going to dictate the messaging. And the other thing it made me think of a Malcolm X quote where he said, I don't even call it violence when it's in self-defense. I call it intelligence. So how can we teach kids to be thinking of aggression in terms of self-defense? And I think a big conversation to be having with kids at an earlier age is body autonomy. Like we need to start teaching kids that their body is their body, and they have a right to dictate who gets to touch it, right? When they want touch, when they don't want touch. I think that's a big conversation that parents or even role models to younger kids need to be able to have that conversation with. And like the good thing is that there's some doctors now that they'll work teaching body autonomy into their pediatrics, right? They'll make sure to communicate that to kids. But I do think body autonomy plays into this idea that I need to be aggressive because I need to protect myself. So I think if we're having a conversation about that, it will help to know when it is self-defense and when it is just plain aggression.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Great point. Was you about to say something, Cobb? I saw you clapping them up.
That was flies, mosquitoes.
All right.
Nah, I was just dapping him up.
Mosquitoes.
I think that that's very powerful. I mean, when he talked about, I know our primary care physician for our family is very intentional with how when she talks to my daughter about that. And then me and my wife just kind of like, again, piggyback off of that idea. Like, you don't, you know, something as simple as like, oh yeah, give him a hug. Like, no, if my daughter doesn't feel like giving a person a hug, we encourage it. It's okay.
Yeah.
You don't want to give them a hug. That's quite all right. You have your reasons. Whatever those reasons are, they're yours and yours alone. You know what I mean? You don't have to feel obligated to give somebody a hug. So yeah. Just kind of like piggybacking and giving kudos to Mike for bringing that to the table.
No, that's real. I know with my daughter, and it's caused a little bit of stir. And I was talking about just how I'm raising my daughter, and it was a little bit of controversy about consent or what have you, with regards to my daughter. People who weren't in the know of in the intricacies of my relationship with her. But that's something I do all the time, right? Like I ask yo, can I have a hug? I don't know the last time I got a real hug from my from my daughter, because now I think it's it's our little thing that I embrace now, right? So I'm like, can I have a hug? She'll come over, she'll put her head out, right? And so I kiss her on the head. Because again, it's not, yo, come give me a hug. Because again, I recognize how that can potentially play going forward. You might feel that you're obligated to give somebody a hug because daddy makes me give him a hug all the time, right? And so I wasn't even aware that I truly asked her, like that I asked her about giving hugs or some type of affection until some months back. I was having a conversation with somebody. It's just like, well, when you engage with her, what do you say? It might have been a Kosovo, because she always won. I'm like, yo, can I have a hug? It's like, exactly, right? Because again, what are we teaching? What are we teaching? Because again, if we're under this idea that we're, especially as fathers, that we're our daughters or sons' first teacher, then we need to truly be showing them what they should expect out in this world. And it is that idea of consent in all situations. Say, bring Mike back in here. Welcome back, Mike. No, we was just bigging up your point.
Thanks.
No doubt. I mean, it's so much more we could touch on this conversation. I'm still feeling the effects of Tito's last night. That's why I was posting on Facebook up a storm, man. Like I had the Tito's courage. Like me and Vodka don't get along all the time. But I definitely think it's we need to,
that juices you be drinking.
Nah, listen, the beauty the beauty in the Four Loko is that you drink one, an hour later, you're fine. All right, that's why I had to realize the deal. Everybody ain't got the wine like you, brother. We not wealthy out in these pandemic streets. You know what I mean? I looked at the $14 bottle. I said, too rich for my blood. You know what I mean? $3. All right, let me grab this. But no, I definitely appreciate y'all, man. We're gonna continue this conversation because I think there's so many more layers, and we could really do like a real deep dive, with more preparation and what have you. So now, listen, as always, I appreciate you all for tuning in. Props to Cobb, who came out of hiding after the last 2 months to join us. Shout out to Zane. Shout out to Mike. We will be
throwing shots in the group text, man. Like I be like, yo, for real, you gonna post like a what's them Jones called? GIFs, right? Like with the shade. I'm like, yo. Shout to me. All right.
No doubt. Appreciate you. Tomorrow we're gonna be back at 7 p.m. because we definitely got to have a conversation about these white folk, these congressmen who are wearing these kente cloths just everywhere and kneeling and just sitting here wilding.
Nancy Pelosi, right?
Nancy Pelosi, just.
Go, Nancy.
I'm just at a loss for words. I'll tell you all about my white Facebook friend. She messaged me and said that she ordered a bulletproof vest so she can escort black folk around. And this was after Ahmaud Arbery's death. And just how that's just not a good look. So white folk, please tune in tomorrow. This episode will be especially for y'all. So until tomorrow, peace.
Be kind.
Be kind, no doubt. Peace.
Peace.
Yeah, I got like that that day after hangover, man, where I can't connect my thoughts or nothing. So
What was it you were drinking? You said
I was drinking some Tito's vodka, and
what's crazy? It's tequila for me, yo.
Yeah.
When it's tequila, I get angry with tequila. I be having to drink tequila and go home.
See, I like tequila. Tequila had me like happy and whatnot. Like this vodka, it was so bad where I woke up this morning. I was like, all right. She was like, yeah, you know you got a whole large Papa John's Italian sausage pizza in the fridge. I said, what? She was like, you told me to order it, and you was telling me how to go through the menu on it. I said, nah, I have no recollection of this. Like, because I was just sitting there sipping. Next thing I know, like I wake up the next morning.
Good.
Yeah, man. So
that's funny.
yeah, I need to get my faculties together. So, but I appreciate y'all, man. I'll holler at y'all.
All right.
All right, peace.